speaking from the Interdevelopmental Institute. And today, in this short video, I want to share a little bit my thinking about the notion of frame of reference. Another concept would be mindset. And I want to take this a little bit beyond the individual frame of reference into the cultural domain. In CDF, the Constructive Developmental Framework, on account of assessments and research in adult development, we have come to believe that every individual constructs his or her own world and is doing so on the basis of what I call frame of reference. And this frame of reference is mostly unconscious and can become conscious only to the extent that you make an effort as an individual to understand yourself. And the three dimensions, according to CDF, in which you can attempt to understand yourself, is the social emotional, of meaning making, the cognitive, of logical and dialectical thinking, and the psychological. And of course, there is a spiritual dimension, which is not covered by CDF, but which has a close relationship to all of these three dimensions, depending on the level of development that we are talking about. So let's have a look at the world. This is a little, I would say, ambitious, but I don't mean it in, I'm not prescribing anything. I'm just sharing some thoughts. I was reading a book on disrupted destiny of the Muslim world. An excellent book, and it brought me to many, many thoughts about what is CDF saying about the present cultural and political world. And I came to see that it's actually saying quite a lot, and that's what I want to talk about. We presently have it seems, we have four historical narratives going in the world: the Muslim one, the South American one, the Chinese one, and the Western one. And of course, the South American is pretty close to the Western, so one might dispute that it deserves its own rubric. But so we have at least 3 or 4 different frames of reference that tell us what history has been and what history is going to be. And in the West, it's all about individual freedom and freedom of speech and all that nice and important stuff. In the Chinese world, as you know, it's all about community and how the individual fits into the community. And in the Muslim world, it's emphatically about community. The ulama, that an individual is integrated into under the notion of one God. And so the astonishing thing that I learned from this book that I mentioned is that these 3 narratives of history are actually not talking to each other. There are 3 different narratives going on about what is happening in the world, what the world order is or should be. And that's an interesting phenomenon. So you would think that many of the global problems would be more easily solved, if we can say solved, if there was one narrative, but we have at least 3, if not 4. So let's just look at our own narrative that comes out of Greek philosophy, the French Revolution, on which the American Constitution is based. what kind of narrative do we have? We assume that if there is some altercation or clash between, let's say, the Muslim world and our world, that the Muslim terrorists and so forth are going for taking away our freedom and our individual liberty. And that's not in their narrative. What they see is the secular world that we live in, that they have, in some sense, shaken off since the 1970s, when all the secular modernists fell, beginning in Persia or Iran. And we are living in the time of a backlash of fundamentalism, not only in the West, but also in Muslim countries. And how do we deal with that? Do we just continue our own little narrative about individual freedom and democracy and so forth? I think there must be, at some point, an attempt to understand the other narrative without imposing our own. Now, what does CDF contributes to that? Contribute to that? Here's what I'm thinking. We know that the psychological profile of a person is deeply shaped by the culture, and that if we look at the psychology of a person in terms of his or her self-concept, or how they approach work, or how they link to other people, we can see that each of us is very different, not only between cultures, but in a particular culture. So there we are looking at a very, very specific set of traits of an individual. If we go to the social emotional domain, we see a much more general picture. We can group people in terms of what level of meaning making are they on? Are they instrumentalists? Are they other dependent? Are they self-authoring, or are they even beyond self-authoring? And if we look at the cognitive level, the picture becomes, in some sense, again, more individualized, because there are many people at the same social emotional level that nevertheless have very different cognitive profiles. So you and I, we may be at level 3 or 4, but the way we think about the world and about history and where we are placed in the history, in history, can be very, very different depending on how far we have gone beyond logical thinking into dialectical thinking, meaning in how far we have learned to think in terms not only of static configurations, but emerging change, intrinsic relationship between things and people, and transformation. And ultimately, I think history is about transformation. It's not about change alone. It's about transformation, but transformation of what? Well, if you assume that history might be about transformation of consciousness, that would be, I think, a possible perspective to take. So then, if we look at different cultures, what can we say about the different consciousnesses that are behind these 3 or 4 different historical narratives we are witnessing today in the world? And, how can we assess them? Well, one thing is clear, to me at least, I don't know what you think, is that most of these, that all of these perspectives people have on themselves and their history has little to do with logical thinking. So it would seem that we would have to transcend logical thinking into dialectical thinking and begin to think more in terms of process, relationship, and transformation to get a handle on how these 3 or 4 different narratives of world history relate to each other. Now, that's a big undertaking, and And it's a research that has not really begun. People haven't even noticed that there is no unified historical concept of what's going on in the world right now. So my hypothesis would be that a major difference between these four frames of reference lies in the cognitive domain. Because in the psychological domain, of course, we are all different, but there's only so much difference we can see in individuals. And these differences of a psychological nature are deeply immersed in the cultural sphere. And I think the cultural sphere had a lot to do with how, whether the majority or minority in a particular culture is at Kegan level 2, 3, 4, or 5. For instance, we in the West, we all aim to be self-authoring, and much of coaching and consulting we do is essentially an attempt to bring people up from level 3 to level 4. So the whole services industry is about that. And so social emotionally, I think we can attempt to develop a perspective on history that makes us see more clearly differences between these different cultural frames of reference. My hypothesis beyond that is that if we begin to think dialectically, we can, and we do some research on how Asians see a fish tank, for instance, how a Muslim cultured person sees a fish tank, and how a Western person sees a fish tank, or him or herself, or anything at all that makes sense to make research about, we might get some interesting perspectives on what really separates us and what unites us. Then it's clear, since we are all human, we have one consciousness, and there is a common ground that we all share, not only in terms of the values we have, but many other things as well. So this is a pretty general talk I wanted to share with you, or offer you. And if you have feedback for me, you might write to otto@interdevelopmentals.org. You might also want to look at the website called interdevelopmentals.org, where CDF is found, which is taught here. And so even if you're not a coach and not a consultant, if you are a politician or you belong to some kind of think tank which takes on global problems, you might be interested in what CDF might be able to contribute to your thinking. You would be most welcome to join our community, to connect to us. And so thank you for your time today. Have a good evening. Be well.